class period. Yes, I am not here for class today. However, I've recorded this video so that you could have the same experience that you would have on any other day. So sit back, relax, grab your Chromebook if you haven't already, log into Google Drive, and get ready to take some notes on today's literature concept just as you would on any other day. If at any time during this video I'm going too fast, obviously I can't tell by taking a look at what's going on around. So you and the substitute teacher can feel free to pause the video at any point to slow everything down if the group wants to catch up. Don't do that too much, but of course if you do get in a bind, then raise your hand to pause the video. Today we'll be talking about narrative perspective, so you might call your notes narrative perspective notes or narration notes. Now before you do any of this, don't forget about the Note Buddy option. And it's something you might want to do today as you did last time. One of you create a file, share it with the other. Both of you have access and both of you can take notes. Remember, it's a good way to shift responsibilities of one type of note-taking to one student and another type of note-taking to another student. Like one of you might copy down everything that's on the board and another might copy down ideas that I am expressing verbally. So you can do that. Okay, hopefully you are ready to take notes. So we can begin. All right, we're talking about narrative perspective, narration, point of view, and let's look at these terms because you have three. I've listed this one as dominant primarily because it's the most specific and the most accurate, but it's also kind of the most challenging. Let's take it apart. We see this word perspective. The word perspective is fairly synonymous with the word point of view. And of course, point of view is defined as the way you look at something. The place in which you stand when you're looking at something. Your position relative to whatever you're looking at. So we have this over here on this side, has to do with perspective, the way you look at something. The word narrative, we've already talked about, means story. So narrative means story. Narration is the telling of a story. So the word narrative perspective means the way you look at a story. Narration is the telling of a story, kind of the way a story is told, and point of view just means, well, point of view. You'll see point of view often. In fact, you probably saw it on the OA practice test we were working on yesterday. However, I think it's probably the least specific. It's the one that has a lot to do with non-literary ideas. I like narrative perspective. It says, this is my way of looking at a story. Narration's pretty good too. This is my way of talking about a story, of telling a story. But I want you to be able to use all three terms and realize that they all basically mean the same thing. This is my way of telling a story. This is a discussion about the ways stories are told. So let's go to the specific definition. The view from which the narrator tells the story. View, narrator tells the story. And we'll divide those views into a number of different types, but I'm making something pretty sophisticated that's pretty simple. The way a story is told. The view from which that narrator tells the story. And let's go with some principles. Principle number one is that narrative perspectives can shift. That makes life pretty interesting. That means that you can start with one person telling a story and then move over to another person telling a story. You can see this in literature, you can see this in television, you can see this in film. Different people telling stories from different perspectives. So it's not always the same person, not always the same perspective. Narrators are not always reliable. This is very very interesting when you start to talk about narrators that can't be trusted for one reason or another. They might not be trustworthy because they are insane. They might not be trustworthy because they are, well, mentally challenged. They might not be trustworthy because they are biased, perhaps, in a story. And you could possibly consider the narrator of War of the Wall as being exceptionally biased, prejudiced against the hunter from the north. So you must ask yourself whether or not you can trust her to see everything clearly. And you must ask yourself, oh, pause, there's an announcement.
Sharon are in the lounge right now with their cards. They have St. Patty's Day and they have some Easter cards if you want to take a look, okay? I'm sure they're beautiful.
Well, there's our commercial announcement for the day. So let's get back to what I was saying. In War of the Wall, you might consider that that narrator is untrustworthy because of her prejudice. And after the story's over, you might ask yourself whether or not you received the story in a clear fashion. Was there something that you missed because the narrator was so biased? You can't really know because of her bias. So let's move on. You can divide narrative perspective into 4 different types. Not 3, but 4. Because we'll divide third person into omniscient and limited. So type those into your notes. You might share responsibilities with your note buddy in typing the column headings. And remember that underneath each, I'm going to give definitions and I'm going to give examples. And those examples should come from this class whenever possible, but they may come from elsewhere as well. Again, pause if you need some extra time, but let's move on. First person perspective. In this one, the narrator is a character in the story and shows the reader only what he or she knows and experiences.
If you're still in the building, please come to the office. Madison Sample.
Okay, let's try this again. The narrator is a character in the story and shows the reader only what he or she knows and experiences. You can divide this definition into 2 parts. 1, the narrator is a character in the story. And 2, that narrator only knows what he or she knows, not what other people know. So your first person perspective limits everything to that one narrator. And you can think of examples that we've read, like 3 skeleton key. You could also think of what we just read, Antaeus, and that October, and the War of the Wall. I believe those are all of our first person perspectives. When you're talking about perspective, you should always talk about who the narrator is. So in 3 Skeleton Key, it is one of the tenders, the tender of the lighthouse. In the War of the Wall, we have an unnamed narrator. And remember, we would use narrator to refer to that person. In Antaeus, we also have an unnamed narrator. And in that October, we have Rudy. First-person voice distinguishes itself, and it's pretty easy to see. We had this discussion yesterday in every class, but I know, especially in 7th period, you guys hit it pretty clearly when you said that first-person voice always includes use of personal pronouns like I, me, we, or us. And if you see those personal pronouns in the narrative, you know that you're in first-person voice. So your notes should contain 3 levels for each one of these. First, you should have a definition. Then you should have some examples. And now you can have a pronoun criterion. Personal pronouns, I, me, we, or us. And let's move on. Again, pause if you need. Okay, let's move to second person voice. This one's a little bit different. The narrator speaks to the audience, including him or her in the action. Excuse me for a moment. Sorry about that. The narrator speaks to the audience, including him or her in the action. And this means, of course, that the narrator uses words like you and your. This is unusual to find in a fictional narrative. You wouldn't often see somebody speaking directly to the audience because the audience usually can make no decisions that will affect the narrative, so why would they be included in the storytelling? I remember when I was younger than you, a series of books called, they were very popular, Choose Your Own Adventure. And I know other similar series were developed, but in these series, interestingly, they wrote in the second person voice, and at the end of each page, the reader was forced to make a decision. So it would say something like, if you decide to walk through the door, go to page 73. If you decide to stay, go to page 114. So you would kind of make decisions on how the story goes. Those books tried to stimulate interest in younger readers by making them think they were characters in the book. So it was different. It's unique. It still stays with me. I haven't seen books written exclusively in the second person voice except for that kind of young adult elementary school trick. Let's talk about the third person points of view now. We can talk first about third person limited. Third person limited is very similar to first person. Let's look at the definition. The narrator is not a character in the story and shows the reader only what one character knows and experiences. So that first principle is different from first person, but the second principle here is the same. Both first person and third person limited limit the narration to one person's perspective. It's just in third person, you don't have a narrator that is a character in the story. That narrator will not be anybody in the story. And we saw that example in the selection that we read yesterday on the OAA about Trino and his mother. It was a third person perspective limited to only what Trino saw and not what his mother saw or knew. So the second part of the definition is the same as first person, but the first part deviates. Your examples in the literature that you read for this unit are pretty ample because authors tend to like either first person or third limited. And so you can have examples like the dinner party, like a day's wait, like stolen day, like the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, like what we read yesterday after 20 years. And let's see if you have any others from this one. No, I think that's everything that you have. Oh, on the banks of Plum Creek, of course, that very short one that you read from the book. Remember that since all of these examples are still limited to one character's point of view, you want to make sure to identify that character when you are discussing third limited. So for the dinner party, you could talk about the American naturalist, who's the author or the narrator there. A Day's Wait, you're talking about the father. Stolen Day, you're talking about the boy who does not have a name. After 20 years, really, you are receiving the story from Bob's perspective for the most part, that man on the street. And Valdemar, of course, Poe uses this P with an anonymous underline as the narrator, and then Plum Creek is told from Laura's perspective. So, whenever you're identifying the third limited perspective in one of those stories, please make sure that you are identifying who the perspective is limited to. Of course, our pronoun criterion is not necessarily that we see he, she, and it. A lot of people will say that, but all perspectives use he, she, and it. More importantly, the author will not use personal pronouns like I, me, or you. So if you see, of course, outside of dialogue and quotation, the author using I or me, you're in first person. If you don't see that, you know that you're in some type of third. Okay, moving on to the final perspective of the four. Third omniscient bears something in common with third limited. However, it's quite a different sort of perspective. The narrator is not a character in the story and shows the reader information from a variety of perspectives. So two principles in this definition once again. First principle is that the narrator is not a character in the story, and of course that bears a lot in common with third limited. Second principle, and this is what's different and unique of all the perspectives, it shows the reader information from a variety of perspectives, from a variety of different characters and different experiences. For some reason, this is not as common in literature anthologies that I've experienced in high school and junior high. Those stories tend to like third limited or first person. But you have a sort of a really easy example to think about when you're considering the film The Lion King. If you're ever wondering how you could think about third omniscient perspective, you can think about that film, which captures experiences of a number of different characters, even if they're not at the same place at the same time. So you can get perspectives from Simba, you can get perspectives from that Scar, the hyenas in the elephant graveyard. Nala, I believe, is given a bit of a perspective in this narrative, and of course that crazy monkey in the tree. So as you hear the story or watch the story of The Lion King, you'll see it from a lot of different characters' perspectives. That's third omniscient. But you don't have any examples from the literature you've read through this unit. Same pronoun criterion as before. So if you want to just copy and paste the pronoun criterion from elsewhere in your notes, feel free to do so. So the author will once again not use personal pronouns like I, me, or you. If you see any of those personal pronouns, you know that you are dealing with some sort of first or second person voice. And that's all four of them. So as you look at the four different narrative perspectives, realizing the second person is barely ever used, you'll see that authors have a variety of choices in how they can tell the story, and the story's shape will change. Its impact on the reader will change based upon the selections that they have made. That's where life becomes pretty interesting in the analysis. Again, I'm going to give you the opportunity to pause. If for any reason anybody wants to pause the video at this point and catch up with notes by sharing with somebody else or rewinding the video to some point, you should probably do it, because I'm about to move on to something that is just a little bit more advanced. Narrative perspective becomes a lot more interesting when you start to think about why an author would choose one perspective over another. You start to consider why an author would use a first-person perspective instead of a third limited. If they effectively give the same amount of information, why would an author choose one instead of choosing the other? Why would an author choose a third omniscient perspective instead of choosing a third limited perspective? And that's why we should always talk about not just what exactly they're using, but why they have used it. What sort of effects this perspective can have on a story. And as we discuss that, we can see a bunch of different possibilities. Different narrative perspectives can be effective in creating or possibly even eliminating suspense. So if you were to choose a first-person perspective, the perspective of somebody that was fairly ignorant to what was going on in the story, and they were feeling anxiety about it, the reader might feel anxiety about it. I could give examples, but in a moment I'm going to ask for you to come up with examples. The perspective could bias the reader for or against one of the characters. So not only can you create anxiety, but you could also create bias. Sometimes bias is good, sometimes bias is bad, and I'm sure you have an example from the literature that you've read where a character might bias you, the reader, against somebody in the story unnecessarily. You might just want to focus on the character of the narrator. That narrator may be the most important part of the story, and understanding him or her may be the focus of everything. So you might consider why exactly the author wants you to focus so much on the character. It's probably because that is the heart of the story, and understanding that person is the point. And we have discussed theme. We discussed theme last week, and this is one of the more complex, but as you develop themes, you might start to realize that the author's selection of a specific narrative perspective helps them carry that theme more clearly. So you might consider how the author has decided to give you a perspective that helps emphasize the theme, emphasize your connection to a certain plot event, perhaps, that develops the theme more clearly. Let's move past that. Here we are. So in the time that you have remaining, and I know I've gone kind of lightning fast through those notes, but of course you'll be able to pause, rewind, and share. I have one last activity for you to round out the remaining minutes. I want you to gather into groups of no more than 3, no fewer than 2. So yes, you must gather into a group. I'd like you to see a story. I'd like you to determine its narrative perspective. And then, and here's the interesting part and the challenging part, discuss why the author chose it. In answering that last question, I have one sort of idea to give to you that can help you answer it. Consider how the story would have been different had it been told by another character. I'll give you an example. Consider Rikki Tikki Tavi, and consider how that story might have changed had it been told from the snake's perspective instead of Rikki Tikki's perspective. You start asking yourself questions like that, hypothetical questions about shifting narrative perspective from one character to the next, then you can start to realize why the author chose the narrative perspective that he or she did. So gather into your groups, pick a story, I don't care which one you pick, as long as we've read it, of course, and I don't care if two groups pick the same story. Determine its narrative perspective and then discuss why the author chose it. At the beginning of class tomorrow, I'm going to do a quick survey of groups and see what you thought. And then we'll try to shape this and hopefully, of course, write about it. If you have questions or concerns, please note them, write them down somehow, and bring them up to me at the beginning of class tomorrow.